great. We had response on those. A couple of things that we learned and that we've wrapped into the presentation when we asked those questions was number one, how many of you guys have actually performed a safety gap analysis or some type of regulatory gap analysis? And of the people that responded, about half had performed some level of gap analysis. So that's great. Again, chime in because we all learn as we work together. Number two, we asked, why do you typically perform those? And of the four options, really the two highest were number one, reputation for your company. And then number two, more focused on fines, penalties, citations. Not surprising. That is a necessary evil of our business to make sure we keep our company insulated from that as much as we can. And then the third one that I wanted to bring up is just what are the challenges of conducting a gap analysis? And the first and the biggest by far, 60% said really just kind of gaining buy-in from leadership. So I hope we provide you with some tips and tools for that as we talk through, and maybe some language that you can use for that. And then the second was really having the safety expertise. And third would be implementing improvements. And so we talk a little bit about that as well too, because we're all kind of on a journey here within our companies from a safety perspective, and how to kind of utilize what we know and what we do to gain that information. So those are some housekeeping items. I'll give you a little background on me. I have a bachelor's in environmental science. My name is Brooke Sinclair. I work with EnSafe. I have a master's in safety management, both of those from the University of Tennessee, and about ready to start fall football season. So go Vols, have to get that in. I'm a CSP and a CHMM. I consulted for about 4 years in the EHS industry, and then I went to a multi-utility here in the local area of Tennessee for about 20 years, and had some pretty good opportunities there. And then I went back into consulting over the last couple of years. So I was fortunate that I got to build a lot of emergency environmental safety and health programs, but I was later moved into some operational roles. And so when you're in operations, maintenance, construction, and engineering, you have to feel the pain of the programs that you developed. And so I try to take that approach when I'm developing things, because I think that it's key to understand the end user when it's all said and done. So this is, we titled it Effective Safety Management, Conducting and Benefiting from a Safety Gap Analysis. And so when I say safety gap analysis, you can exchange that for any other type of regulatory program. So whether it's pipeline safety, it could be environmental, it could be as workers' comp. We have several types of gap analysis that we do and that I did as an internal stakeholder as well too. And I think that you can exchange that from any of those topics. So what are some of the topics that we'll cover? The first is the benefits. And, when you're talking about this, why take on this additional work? This is just another thing that we can do. What am I going to actually benefit from this in my day-to-day work as an EHS professional? So that's where we'll start. And then we're going to shift to starting with the end in mind. So I always think about, at the end of the day, what does success look like in this project that I'm managing, or this task that I'm performing? There are many factors that influence this process when we talk about a safety gap analysis and the outcomes. If you kind of know what the factors are, then you can kind of work ahead to pave the way for maybe a smoother and certainly a more beneficial gap analysis. And then we'll talk about conducting the gap analysis, and just like this presentation, that can go a lot of different directions. So when we talk about a gap analysis, we're going to talk about, there are different flavors, there are different focuses, and there are different levels and depths and breadth. So what's right for you? What's right for your company and where you are right now? Because we look at it more like a right-sized approach. And that sounds simple, but what does that really mean? And then we'll transition over to just managing challenges. Like, how do we manage the challenges that come up with an assessment? Because really every assessment is going to have challenges. You got leadership above you, you've got staff on the floor or in the field, you've got other program owners like incident investigation. You may have to deal with safety, risk, legal, workers' comp, but you've got to navigate all of that. And really, you may uncover some major issues. And are we prepared to deal with that? And how do we do that? And then lastly, we've got some tips and some tools that we'll kind of show at the end. And again, we're looking at this from a perspective, if you do this internally or externally, just some things to think about as you're working through this process. And I've been conducting these for at least the last 20 years, and I've just learned a lot from that perspective, both being as in industry and owning those programs, and then on the consulting side of responding to requests for proposals and just requests from clients. And so just helping you kind of navigate that piece. So again, we'll talk about safety, but you can insert any other regulatory program into the same kinds of concepts here. So what is a safety gap analysis? Well, it's really just a systematic process to evaluate something. And that something can be your top 5 risks. That something could be your highest safety program costs, or areas of most incidents, or really all your safety programs. Because regardless of the depth and the level, the 2 fundamental principles that you have to make sure that you're implementing to get a good gap analysis is it has to have a planned, systematic approach, and you really need to understand and define what you're comparing your programs to. Where's the bar? And that's what you kind of build from. So to make this valuable, you'll be assessing compliance at a minimum. To me, that's kind of like your minimum federal or state safety standards. And then also identifying areas of improvement to enhance that overall safety performance and risk management. Again, many companies use additional standards that they'll compare to, but at a minimum, we're focused on compliance, especially for your first gap analysis. So we've got a quick poll that Bonnie's going to pull up and drop into the chat. And while she's popped that in there, our question is like, where is your organizational culture? Culture matters. Are you guys really kind of operationally focused? And there's nothing wrong with any of these. And if you think about operationally focused, we don't really focus on compliance. We don't really have any drivers at this time versus we're kind of conditionally compliant. So if you kind of think about it from that perspective, we're compliant in most areas, but not so much in others. Or are you fully compliant? Like we know what the requirements are. We have a culture of compliance. That's what drives us. Or are you on that other end of the scale of not only are we compliant, but we also typically adhere to all the industry standards, so think like NFPA or ANSI and IEEE and maybe even ISO for some of you. And then that last piece would be, are you a champion? So I'm compliant. I deal with all the industry standards, and I also participate in other organizations that kind of drive improvements. These things it's kind of important early on to kind of know what your where you kind of are culturally. So as those kind of come in, I want to keep going, and then Bonnie, you pipe in when we have some results that we'll work with. So
Yeah, we have a lot. Everyone pretty much
Okay.
participated in the poll. Yeah.
So how do we looking? Where are most people landing?
Conditionally compliant.
Okay, not surprising, right? Most people have, I probably managed about 90 regulatory programs when I worked in industry, and that was environmental, safety, health, emergency planning and preparedness. I had some physical security. I also owned natural gas, so we had PHMSA requirements we had to deal with, DOT. When you start stacking those up, those numbers really grow with compliance. And so again, a good gap analysis is great. Maybe yours is more targeted, focusing on those programs that you're really not so sure about. So that's good. And I think it also helps that people know you're not alone in this as well. So that's great. So what are the benefits? Why spend the time to conduct this gap analysis? Because really, regardless of what your culture is and regardless of where you are, I'll say on your compliance journey, a gap analysis of some depth, some level is beneficial. And so just kind of thinking what those are. Number one, that helps to ensure compliance with regulations. You want to be inspection ready. And I think it's probably more important when you've got some programs that you're not so sure about. It also enhances employee safety. So when we talk about how you get buy-in from your leadership, these are some things that you could probably use for that. How does it help employee safety? Well, because realistically, when you're out there looking and you're doing a gap analysis, you're going to see things that need to be improved. And some of those are going to get improved in the moment, and some are going to go on a list and get improved over the long term. Plus, when your employees see, again, if you handle this right, if your employees see that you're putting focus on it, they'll put more focus on it as well. And reality is, everyone on the call knows what you measure, what you look at, you'll improve. There's also a great opportunity to reduce some direct and indirect costs. So think about doing a gap analysis on your workers' comp program. Where can you really improve maybe response to the employee and better health, better care, workers' comp care, but maybe also how do we get employees back to work quicker? How do we do better case management? Another could be how do we reduce the downtime of, lost days and the other metrics that we look at. It'll improve efficiency and productivity because, believe it or not, when you take a step back and you look at a process, those of us in the safety field, like our brains are typically wired towards just process improvement anyway. So we can add a lot of value there. In fact, at the utility I used to work for, we debriefed after every major outage. And that was part of my role as I handled all the debrief work. I was concerned that we were getting out into the field too quickly and not conducting job safety briefings. And we would have 50, 60, 100 crews that would come in and do work for us in a major storm event. But what we found was they're actually sitting around for about 45 to 90 minutes. And so we had plenty of times to do a briefing, but we also had an opportunity to save quite a bit of man hours when we worked our next storm, because we put a process in place to have good job safety briefings with our crews and our outside help. But we also cut out a lot of sitting and waiting for jobs to be dropped onto the crews, because we had workers that were set up to do that for the next storm that we worked. So great opportunity there. It builds a big positive reputation with your employees, with your contractors, with your customers, as well as your regulatory entities. So if you're proactive, you're more likely to get some grace when you do have an issue if you're having those proactive conversations. And then lastly, facilitates that continuous improvement, because you're not going to improve something you don't know anything about. And so it's important that we know where we are. So when should we conduct a gap analysis? Well, there's all these reasons here. Regulatory changes. So, you've had a rule that's changing. For instance, the heat rule right now is on the street from OSHA to really drastically change the way most states are operating from a heat index standpoint. So regulatory changes, it could be you've had a pretty major incident and you've identified some gaps there, and it pulls a thread, and you need to look a little deeper into maybe all of the root causes or contributing factors. It could be an expansion. Lots of expansion is going on now. You could be buying new facilities, taking over other companies or utilities. You might be doing something where you're doing a new process or a new task. Lots of leadership change right now. We're seeing that in a lot of companies that we work with. We're at a point where a lot of people are retiring, and we've got new leadership coming in, and it's just a great way for the new leadership to feel comfortable that everything is addressed. And if not, that's a great opportunity for funding, people, things that you need to be able to make some improvements. And then acquiring maybe a new service or new product or a new technology. For a lot of our manufacturing clients, this is a big deal for them. And then lastly, a lot of routine reviews where maybe you have a quarterly targeted review of, if you have 25 programs, you look at a portion of those each quarter, or you may want to do one big analysis annually, so that you have a good pulse on what's going on. So I'm going to assume that everybody's here because they're thinking like, I want to do a gap analysis, or I've done them and I want to get better. But I want you to start by stopping. The plan is really, really key. And for those of you that that are young and don't know who Yogi Berra is, Google him real quick, but I think he says it well. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And so we want to make sure that we end up where we want to end up. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to end up with everything's compliant. We're so excited. But it really means that the end product is what we expected to get out of this effort. So some questions to kind of ask yourself as you're brainstorming and putting this together, whether it's a team or maybe you're using a third party, why are we taking on this initiative? And frankly, what could go wrong? I want to be thinking ahead of how to mitigate some of those issues, whether it's people, processes, lack of information, something, what could go wrong? How in depth do I want to go? How is this going to be communicated? What are we going to say and how are we going to say it? Who's going to be on the team? Who needs to be communicated to so that everyone feels like they're part of the process? Who are my stakeholders? What's going to be a showstopper? I think we all know, like, if we do this, it's over. Like, we won't finish this effort. What are those things, and what does success look like in the end? And if there are any others, that's a good thing to drop into the chat. If there's anything else, again, a lot of you guys have a lot of good background. Drop it into the chat. So let's talk about what are some possible pitfalls. So where we see, and we talked to a lot of different clients, that's the great thing when consulting, right? You get to hear a lot of different perspectives. So we kind of compiled this list from either conducting them or just our past history of doing this for so many years. But it starts right out the gate with, if the scope is not well defined, then we go awry pretty quickly. And so an inadequate scope, number one. And then, just unmanaged expectations. And when I think of unmanaged expectations, like, you thought one thing, your boss thought another, and the two did not align. Or it could be lack of stakeholder involvement, just not communicating and planning and getting people involved. And, I conducted one analysis and a key player was not there the whole week. Well, it's something we can deal with, but it wasn't ideal. And so that's important. Could be insufficient data collection, like, you just may not be able to get to the things you need to get to. Maybe it's mostly a desktop review and you really need to be on site to get into the documents, work practices, whatever that could be. Maybe an overemphasis on compliance. There's a difference if you just really want to be compliant, you want all your holes addressed from a compliance standpoint. That does not necessarily mean, and most times does not mean, you've addressed all of your true safety, behavior, and condition issues. And so really kind of understanding where that bar is and where you want that to be is really, really key. And not overemphasizing just compliance, because then you've missed a great opportunity. Another could be, failure to appropriately assess the risk. And so that's a big one. When we're conducting gap analysis, we risk rank all of the programs so that, like, if I were in your shoes, these are the first 5 things I would work on. I wouldn't worry about these. I would worry about these. And there's a mix of how that comes into play. It could be, this is the highest injury potential, and it's a significant injury or fatality potential. That's one thing. Or in this state, they really, really focus on X. And so we need to focus on X too. You don't really have a program for that. And you got a really high potential for a fine or penalty here, which is really, really key, and probably more so even on the environmental side. So thinking about it from that perspective. And then just not allocating the right kind of resources, whether it's the team that's conducting the gap analysis or the people that are involved in getting the data that you need to be able to do a good gap analysis, or crews or workers on the floor, whatever, maintenance staff that you can take can be escorts because they're knowledgeable about the process. And then not considering the organizational culture, which is where our first kind of question came from. And we're going to show you a curve here in a couple minutes that will help you with that as well too. There's nothing worse than conducting this gargantuan gap analysis, knowing you're going to end up with 200 findings or 200 issues, and it's just really not going to fly within the organization. I think it's more important to know we can take this in bite-sized chunks. We can't take a big overall review. Or you may be at a point where you need that big review because you really want to justify resources. And that's another lens that you would put on how deep you go in your gap analysis. And then lastly, it's just rushing the process. Again, you can do anything in any amount of time that's allotted, but you may not get everything at the end. And that's really what you need to know is where you want to be at the end. So there's some typical steps. I'm going to work through each of these, establishing the scope, preparation and review, and then there's really the observation and evaluation component, and then it moves into summary and feedback, and then action development. So we'll tick through each of these to really kind of get you through what the gap analysis could look like. So the first would be establishing the scope. So some things to think about when you're establishing the scope. The first one is what's your organizational size and complexity? Like, do you have 200 employees or do you have 250 employees, 2,000 employees, 100,000 employees? How big are you? Small manufacturing facility, 100,000 square feet, or are you spread out over 3 states? You got 5 small shops and bulk of the work kind of happens from the truck. All those things kind of make a big difference in how you want to structure your scope of work. And then industry specific requirements. Are you looking at just compliance? Do you have industry standards you need to comply with? How does that work? And then what work is being performed by your employees versus contractors? And how closely do you want to look at contractors? Are you at a point where that's something that you can really focus on or not? Another would be regulatory requirements. So again, OSHA in my state, there is a TOSHA that I have to look at as well. If you're in California, all bets are off. You're 100% Cal OSHA, Cal EPA. How does that, what regulations are we complying back to? And if you're an ISO organization, you have that lens that is minimum standards as well too. And that gets into those industry standards as well as, what are your existing safety programs? I've worked with some pretty large companies that have one safety plan and it's about 25 pages long, but they really have about 20 safety programs that they need to comply with, like confined space and lockout tagout. So not a lot of content, but a lot of hazards. And then I have the flip side of that with some clients that not only have written safety programs for every program you can imagine, but they also have specifications that layer on top of that. And so where does that, how much documentation are you going to actually work through? What's your risk profile? I mean, obviously, if I'm on a construction site with, heavy machinery as my job, high fall hazards, high risk, dangerous equipment, that's probably one level of review from a field perspective. And if I'm in a plant with high chemicals, same thing. But if I have more retail office, maybe some truck environment, that's a different level. And then incident history always plays a big key role in there. And then what are your stakeholder expectations? So when I'm thinking about right size, those are the things, those are the levers and the bars that kind of work together to determine where you start, where you go, because really the investment of that will equal success. Because I'm looking at 3 factors. What's the duration? Like, how much time do I legitimately have to do this gap analysis? Is this a 2-day effort? Is that what the expectations are? Or is this a 2-week effort? 2 days, I'm probably doing mostly a document review, desktop review. If I've got 2 weeks, I'm in the field, I'm looking at, their stand-up meetings and their tailboard sessions. I'm looking at their documentation. I'm asking good questions to their leadership to see where they are, and it just depends. And that gets to the depth. So are we digging in this to the other side of the world, or are we just trying to get that first initial review to just kind of see where we are so we can have an in-depth targeted assessment? And the last would be the level. Are we touching a single program, 2 or 3 programs, or are we going to the moon and back? We need to know what those expectations are, because every company is on a journey. This is the DuPont Bradley curve. It's been around a long time. Great thing to Google. And although no curve and no system is perfect, it's a pretty good I'll say gut check to kind of see where you are organizationally. Do you live on the left side, which is more reactive? Um, I do things because I'm afraid to get caught not doing them. Or you way on the other side where it's much more of everybody's committed to safety. You've really integrated that into even the newest worker kind of coming in, and that's your culture, and it's much more about influence and engagement than it is about discipline and do it because I said so. So, kind of knowing where you are and going into that gap analysis with eyes wide open, um, you just got to realize you're going to kick over some rocks and open some closet doors that some people, including yourself, if you're going to be honest about it, may not want to be exposed. So, I periodically will come back to this Bradley curve when I'm thinking about an organization, and it just helps me to use like the right words to kind of pause where I need to pause and just take in what the culture is and observe a little bit more instead of talking as much. Because I know that everybody's kind of on that curve somewhere and they're always working to get better. We backslide, we take great leaps, but we kind of need to know where we are because this effort could have a pretty profound effect on your organization and be very valuable if we don't take that lightly and really work in the process. Okay, so step two, prep and review. So first we have to start with data collection, obviously. We're looking at current practices, work tasks, hazards, like what do we do here? Then we move to a program applicability review, and that's where we're saying, okay, based on the work tasks you guys do at this company or within your company, here's all the things that are applicable to you. And then we review the existing safety programs, and that could be your policies, programs, procedures, training records, kind of the record piece. Then we kind of move to the risk part, like based on what you do and what you have, what's already existing, and what we saw in the field, here's kind of how we rank your lockout tagout program, your confined space program, your respiratory protection program, your hearing conservation program. That way you kind of have a little bit of a guide to know where to get to. And that's a great internal tool to use as well too, is to try to figure out how to talk about, don't major in the minors, talk about the things that really matter. We look at your incident history as well too, and I think that's a great thing. Even though you may be involved in every incident that happens at your company, when you do a gap analysis, take a step back, pull 3 to 5 years worth of incidents, and at least look at a majority of those because they tell a story. And then lastly, we're, always looking at what are the regulatory and standards requirements that we're comparing them to. And that's just kind of our compliance check. But I think there's a lot of value in doing benchmarking as well too, with your peer companies. So we wrap a lot of that into this tool here. And this was actually one that we used for a client in California. So we have all the Cal OSHA, Cal EPA requirements there, and it's just kind of a snapshot. But you can see like what's the program, what's the regulatory reference, all of those green in the green section. That's kind of their general job descriptions, not really job classifications, but it's really trying to bucket them up. And then what is what's required? Does it require a written program or not? You kind of you have to know what's in the reg to know what you have to have. And so we have a little system where we kind of rank it that way, and then we do the risk ranking, which is at the end there, based on what we saw. So this is kind of a living document that works through that whole process for us. And then we move back to step three, where this is the on-site part. And again, this gets into how many days do you have. The on-site review is really all about determining how compliant you are with those written documents, with your training, with regulatory requirements, industries, anything you've written down, and comparing that to your actual practices, equipment, completed documentation. They tell the story of, are they, you have it, you said you've trained on it, is it actually getting implemented to the worker level? And that's a great opportunity to highlight some real improvements there. I can check all those regulatory boxes, but we're looking for effectiveness. And that's kind of that going beyond compliance in this step here. Step 4 is where you get to that summary and feedback. So finding a really good way that works within your culture to provide an update on the gaps. And that's why we've kind of gone to this risk-based update so that you can understand the severity and the organizational impact so that you know where to focus on those most critical areas. So again, whatever works in your company, that's what you want to do. I worked for a company once, we were not allowed to use red. So it didn't matter how bad the situation was, we just could not use red. So we used an orange. And so there are things like that that really matter. And then in this step, once you kind of have that in draft form, you really want to get some feedback and you want to listen to it. Again, you don't have to agree with it. At the end of the day, we're not trying to win every single battle, right? Like we want to win the war. We want to move the organization forward. So I'm willing to concede on some things and work in some feedback that I may not 100% agree with just to move things forward so people feel a part of that process. Because I want to get to the action plan piece. This is perfect. You know, the process gets us here, which is where we want to be. And that's how do we develop action plans that are going to actually get implemented within our companies. And so think about, we obviously want them to be specific measures, smart, time tied, all those kind of things. We want some owners associated with them, but we need to be realistic. Some of the emergency debriefs that I've worked, we wanted to hear everybody because we wanted everybody to feel like they had a say. And you would end up with 300 things that you needed to fix for the workforce, but that's not realistic. So my strategy was always bucket those up as much as I can and put those under lesser numbers of action items. And then frankly, there's some that are just below the line that we're just not going to do. And so I think it's important to just communicate that and say, at this point, whether it's funding, time, the risk level, and that's why risk is a great tool, it's just not red. So we're just not going to spend the time on it at this point. Eventually we will, but we're not there yet. And then have some way to implement and monitor those. And again, every culture is different, but how do you get those executed within your company, especially if you don't have a lot of leadership buy-in? That's the great thing about compliance. Most companies, their CEO really doesn't want to go to jail. They don't look good in stripes, whatever that could be. All jokes aside, they have a responsibility and they know it. It's more about, do we show that in a way that they can understand it, understand the risk, and understand things that can easily be done to get you as a company where you need to be. And that's really where our job comes in as EHS professionals across the industries. And then lastly, I want to talk about managing change. And we've got a poll here that Bonnie will pop up in a second. Managing change is hard. It's very hard within organizations. Plus, we are seeing a lot of turnover, a lot of retirements, and a lot of new people and a lot of new roles, even if you're within the same company. You're still in a new role, still trying to get rid of the role you had and then start on the one that you need to learn. So many companies will have a change management process where there's actually approvals and so on and so forth. If you don't have that yet, there's still 3 things to kind of think about. And the first one would be, how are you going to carry out this improvement plan? But how are you communicating it? Regular and clear communication is key across all levels of the organization. So kind of getting out, your chart says, who's above me, who's beside me, how do I communicate all levels and what's appropriate? And then monitoring for effectiveness. They're great leading indicators. They're great lagging indicators, especially when you're looking at a gap analysis. How do you use those to your advantage? May not just be numbers, but it may be like percent complete on time. We're not perfect. Things happen, especially with supply chain now. So how do you tell the story without having to get into the details every single time until you need to? And then reviewing and adjusting. I had a process once where every quarter we had we broke up our reviews quarterly, and then we kind of had an end of the year wrap up. And that's a great way to take all that message together and then really celebrate all the changes that you've made. So, yeah, Bonnie's got the poll up. What's the biggest challenges that you've had in implementing the findings? Because that was one of the questions that came up. Are you is it allocating resources, just really getting the money to do it? Is it gaining buy-in again, communicating findings effectively, or is it tracking and measuring improvements?
Yeah, it looks like it's tied right now between allocating resources for corrective actions and gaining buy-in from leadership.
Okay, great. So thinking about those two things, companies spend money on what they find important and valuable. And we have in our brains the thousand reasons why our company needs to do X, Y, or Z. So I think it's really key of showing, maybe in a little creative way, of the, again, in bite-sized chunks. Like, if you have no lockout tagout program, but you do a lot of uh, you see a lot of maintenance and work that's happening on electrical systems, panels, whatever, and things should be locked out. How do we start small and start to work our way up to something bigger? And it's usually not sending your boss a video of an art flash event that's happened like that. The shock and awe usually doesn't work, but thinking about your culture and thinking about how to implement that and really having a long-term plan is really the key. I look back on organizations that I've worked with and just seeing where they are from day one to maybe 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 years later. It feels tough in the middle, but how do you work your way through that? And another tip that I always had was making sure that I knew, and I always kind of kept the list with me on my laptop, tablet, whatever, of are my highest concerns, issues, action items, whatever, from a safety perspective and an environmental perspective, because I wanted to be ready to talk about it at a minute's notice. And so I think just having that information, which is what a gap analysis will do for you, is really key so that when you have that opportunity to talk about it, and every time you have that opportunity to talk about it, you can. Thanks, Bonnie. All right, so we'll kind of transition into some tips first and then some tools that we develop. And of course, you can screen shoot any of these, and if you this recording will be available for later, so you'll have them as well too. But just kind of thinking about some tips and as a wrap up for what we've talked about. First one is having and giving clear direction, clear scope of work about the intent of the analysis that you're performing. Focusing on planning and preparation first. All the communication, all the work that happens there makes the whole rest of that so smooth. Take lots of notes, because you may not deal with something immediately. You may need to deal with it later, but be diligent about your pictures. Pictures are wonderful, but they tell a story, sometimes not always the best story. And we have some clients that are public sector type, that have open records requests very, very easily. And then we also always have, can be deposed from the private side as well too. So just think about the records that we're creating. Understand the possible impact of the analysis to you, to your fellow workers, and to your company. So, go into this with eyes wide open and think about those questions we asked on the front end, showstoppers. What are some things that are really going to kill this effort? And more importantly, what can I do to mitigate any roadblock that I think is going to come up in my way? And then lastly, manage expectations. Man, I could not say that enough. We just completed a very, very, very large gap analysis, and this company in particular wanted to justify, if we felt it was needed, justify staff. And so that is a very different request than, can you just come in and look and just give me an idea of like my top 5 issues I need to work on. And so it's not only managing expectations with maybe your third parties or whatever, but it's managing expectations for your coworkers. And hey, this is not what that's for, or it is what this is for. So make sure you get into some detail about that, as well as up and down. Employees want to know what's going on. And so I think it's really key that we have a communication plan, we talk about it, because a good gap analysis, we're going to be in their work environment. You should be too. So letting them know that's what that is, as opposed to, hey, someone's in trouble, must be we did something wrong, or we had an incident 3, 4 weeks ago, 4 months ago, and this must be the fallout of that. You want this to be a positive thing. And you also want them to know we can't fix everything. So having those pre-conversations, managing those expectations with your boss, your coworkers, employees that you support and provide services to, like that's a really, really key component. So honing in on that just a teensy bit more, some things to think about. The 5 things that I always think about in a gap analysis is, first of all, duration. Just talked about that earlier. The expected depth, how much, desktop versus on-site, how much on-site are we gonna have? In fact, I have one client that they have a pretty robust auditing program, but they're trying to work in ways to do less paper review and more on the shop floor review. So one of the things we helped was to rewrite some of their protocols and really called out like on the shop floor, like this is what you need to be doing in the field. And I think that's really key. um Understanding the level, so again, how many things are we looking at, and then what are the deliverables? Again, is this a summary report with some spreadsheets on the back like the gap analysis, the applicability tool that I showed you earlier, or is this a 50-page report that has infinite detail of all the observations that we've made? And we have clients ask for all everywhere in between. So what is your expectation of what that's going to look like at the end? And then the staff that's involved, um, that this takes time, and it takes more time than just the assessors. There's some pre-work, there's some pulling of records by someone else probably, and then there's some time on site and being escorted and working with your counterparts, or maybe your operational, your manufacturing, your maintenance staff, whatever. All of those people are involved to make this a really, really good effort, because the absolute positively worst thing that you can hear, whether it's me as a consultant or you as an internal person, is that's not what I expected. So you never want to hear that. So how do we address that before we have to address that? So a couple tools that we have. The first one is, again, to help you kind of think about the end result. We have kind of this little bit of criteria here. We kind of break up into 4 tiers because that seems to work. Pretty much everything we can put into a bucket. There may be some one-offs, but for the most part, we can put some things in a bucket. So let's talk about standard, which is typically what we get when we get the request, and then we kind of move up or down from there. So in a standard safety gap analysis, environmental gap analysis, we're looking at things like compliance, your training, your policies, procedures, your emergency response preparedness, have you identified all your hazards, and have you done risk assessments? Kind of what we're looking at there. If we go down to just a compliance review, we're really just looking at, are you complying with all the requirements set forth by OSHA or your state agency, EPA, your state agency, and how that works. So those are all things to kind of think about. Another one that, and this is a big document for us that we've broken into a few slides for you, is in that review, and again, I'll take the standard again, the work that has to happen is, working sessions right at the beginning. These are better to be in person if we can do them in person, any of our working sessions. Not the kickoff, but the true like working sessions. It's not as helpful when everybody's on Teams. You just can't share as well for those. The depth of the document review is going to be extensive. The time that's going to be involved with the client, or again for you with your other work groups that you're working with, is pretty significant. We are going to look at on the job actual practices. That's typically included. But what's not included is we will see effectiveness, but it's not usually something that the client's always asking for. So again, those are the kinds of things we're thinking about. Recommendations are typically pretty, what we would call comprehensive. So it's a pretty good list, usually by program, and then it kind of breaks into some general overarching action items, and recommendations. But at the end of the day, it's not a here's your 3-year roadmap, which we have done for clients as well too. That's more on the advanced side. So again, all questions to ask yourself. And then lastly, on the deliverables, again, if we take that standard risk assessment again, what does the report look like? Well, it's typically say 10 to 12 pages by the time you have your report that talks about what you did and when you did it and your observations. You kind of have some of that verbiage so that your company gets a flavor for what you saw and heard and looked at. And then typically there's some attachments that goes with it. Again, we would use that applicability review. Another thing we have is we call them program performance verification assessment. So that's kind of looking at a detail of like your HASCOM program, your lockout tagout program, any of those. Does it have all the requirements in it accomplished? So we would attach those as appendices. We're going to look at your job functions, like who does what, and kind of get to a little more detailed level than it would just be across the company you do these things. We get a little more granular at that standard level, and that's what you need to ask yourself. Are we going to get down to what employees need to be, or what employees have certain tasks, and of those tasks, what's the requirements that they should have in place? And that kind of gets us to our risk matrix and our training needs assessment. So once I know the work tasks by the different roles or job classifications, and it's a good look to see like what kind of training do they have and what do they need. And so that's a good spreadsheet to have as well too. So those are some tools hopefully that will be helpful, and we'll kind of end on a poll, and then certainly if there's any questions or anything we can talk about, we can go there. So thank you, Bonnie. She got the poll up. So this actually came from one of the questions, what do I do if I uncover something that's maybe untrue or not accurate, or maybe the previous EHS manager was pencil whipping forms, or hopefully not falsifying, but maybe there's some concern there. In a gap analysis, discuss it with your management. And this is all culture based. Discuss with your management immediately, contact your regulator, get a second opinion, or ignore it and just let somebody else deal with it. I'm only going to work here a year anyway. I hope nobody picks the last one. So we'll give everybody a second to kind of get those in and see what that looks like. And then we'll talk about it. Miss Bonnie, do we have anybody? Did we keep everybody and they're answering in?
Yeah, we have a majority have answered. Yeah, nobody picked ignore and let someone else deal with it, so that's good. Most people picked discuss with management immediately. A couple people picked get a second opinion.
So I think those two are obviously the best place to start. So you may be newer to EHS. I mean, we're seeing people from other parts of organizations coming into those roles because your technical knowledge, and you may have a brain just for making sure things are safe. Like, you're coming into some new roles, right? You may not be sure. So getting a second opinion before you take it to your management, that may be the right answer for you, especially in the pre-poll when we had about 20% of people said, they don't know all the safety requirements. So that's a good thing to think about. The other piece is, yes, talking to your management. Now, again, there are all different ways to talk to your management. You can come in and just scare them to death, or you can say, let's walk through this because here's what I'm seeing, and just paint the picture of what you're seeing and be ready to discuss. Here are the potential outcomes for this. Again, there's no emotion in this. This is work. This is business. We all have to get things done. We have a responsibility to our companies, but there's some great opportunity to, and maybe even suggest that to your management, as we might need a second opinion on this. There are all different ways and requirements and of how you can even talk to your regulator without any kind of legal requirements on the back end, but sometimes you have to fill out a form and there's some things that you have to do to be able to do that. So I definitely recommend talking to your boss if you feel comfortable, getting a second opinion if you're not sure about your current expertise, and then maybe kind of thinking through, just spend the time to plan that out. Obviously, you can tell I'm a planner. Before you have that conversation so that it goes the way you want it to go. So with that, that's the end of our presentation. That QR code kind of takes you to EnSafe's a specific web page, and EnSafe. If you have any questions, feel free to use that. That's also my email address, my cell phone. You're welcome to call as well and ask any questions. Send emails afterwards. Anything we can do to help. Obviously, that's what we want to do.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Yep. Thank you.